Good evening all, and welcome. This video has been graciously sponsored by Skillshare. If you didn't know already, this amazing platform offers a variety of online classes on literally everything you can think of, taught by the experts. And with so many of us being stuck at home, like me, it might be time to brush up on existing skills or learn something entirely new. I've decided to take it back to basics and start doing my piano lessons again. I did miss piano, and with the help of Eve Williams, I have been making some serious progress. I do love the piano. So, I highly recommend checking that out if you're interested in playing, but there are also so many other classes you can do, so just go nuts. You can learn anything you want. The first 1,000 people who click the link in my description will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium, which is beyond worth it, so go ahead and make the most of it. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. 4 years ago, I needed serious surgery to remove a tumor in my brain. The doctor said everything was going to be nice and easy, but it took me 2 years to return and finish school. The surgery went so poorly that while anesthesiologists and nurses were trying to keep me alive, the surgeon had a conference with my parents to keep them up to speed. Brain bleeding, severe swelling in the brainstem, etc. What's weird is that during this conference, my mum's cell phone rang. The caller ID showed it was coming from my cell phone. I had put my dad in charge of my cell phone in case the worst were to happen, notify my friends and my girlfriend that I had passed. Anyway, he pulls out my phone from his pocket and it's turned off with the battery removed. They wrap up the meeting with the surgeon and then they walk to the nurse's station to thank them for looking after me. My mum's phone buzzes twice. She has a voicemail left by whoever was calling her from my phone. She listened to it and she heard my voice. "Hey Mum, it's me. I know things are weird right now, but I'm sitting here on this bench and I'm warm. I think everything's going to be okay. Talk to you later. Say hi to Dad for me." About a month after the surgery, when I had recovered and moved back home, my mum had me listen to the voicemail, and I couldn't believe it. I turned white. I cried. When I heard my own voice, I thought maybe I had died and was being punished. I immediately opened my phone and looked through the call history. There, I saw the timestamp of an outgoing call on the date of my surgery. 20 minutes after, I was wheeled into the operating room. I don't know what in the world caused this. I work on an adult oncology unit, where unfortunately we have a lot of comfort care patients. The majority of them transition to hospice, where they live out their final days. Sometimes they don't quite make it and pass away while they're still in the hospital. We have the most deaths in the hospital in our unit, and a lot of floats don't like coming up to our floor because everyone dies. We all love it though, and wouldn't have it any other way. There's so much love between the nurses and our patients. We get to know them really well. When people pass away, we have noticed that, unsurprisingly, it comes in threes. We will go a few weeks with no one passing away. Everyone successfully makes it out of there and goes home or to a hospice or a TCU or wherever they go to pass on, only to have a week or two where we will have 3 to 6 deaths a week. One week we had 2 patients pass away in one night. One of the patients was in room 8. She was really near and dear to our hearts, and it was a rough time for everyone involved. She had been on the floor for a prolonged period of time, and we all watched her go from a spry old lady to basically wasting away in all aspects. She passed on nights, and by the next day there was a new patient in her room. It's hard on all of us, but as we all know, patients come and go, and we have to move on. I was doing the admission with the new patient and going over room orientation stuff. I explained that she had a one-stop shop remote which controlled the lights, TV, radio, and had the call light. Right as I finished explaining to her that the TV buttons are right here, I set the remote down on her bed and instantly the TV turned on by itself. It began flipping through each channel at an alarming rate, faster than if you were to hold down the channel up button. She was a little older and thankfully not too observant, and I thought I was doing it, but no one was touching the remote. She says, "No thank you, I don't want to watch TV right now." So I reached down and tried to turn it off. It didn't switch off. I ended up panicking a bit inside and yanking the remote out the wall and telling her that it seemed not to be working properly and that I would get her a new one. The TV still wouldn't turn off after I unplugged the remote from the wall, and normally it would be all connected and not work if it wasn't plugged in properly. I ended up having to walk and manually shut the TV off. I headed out of there, telling her I'd be right back, and as I went to the nurse's desk to grab another one, I ran into another nurse. She was grabbing another remote, which was odd. We just got a new shipment in, and they were all normally working properly. We rarely had to replace them anymore, and I asked her if her remote was broken too, and she said that hers was acting up. I asked her which room she was in, and it was another room that a patient had passed in the night before also. The TV remotes were uncharacteristically acting up from across the wing at the same time, in the same rooms that people had died the night before. Freaky. I could ramble forever, but most stories are related to the TV. I had another situation similar to the one I just described, where the volume was going up and down by itself in a room where a patient had passed on recently. I've seen lights not work and then work again. I have even seen a sink turn on when there was no one else around. We have several designated rooms that are reserved for our comfort patients, and even when they are unoccupied, we will walk by them and it feels like someone is there. But when we look, it's clearly empty. We've had a room where IV pumps stopped working and BP machines quit on us, and nothing seems to work. But that room got cleansed by a healing touch volunteer, which I know sounds crazy, but now everything in the room works just fine. But that's a story for another day. I've never been a huge believer in the supernatural, but after working in this unit for the past year, it's not hard to believe in the paranormal. We all just embrace it because what can you do really? I work as an elderly care worker down in the southwest of Australia. I love my job and love all my residents who I look after and gain real cool friendships with. Sometime in early 2018, one of my favorite residents was put on palliative care, end-of-life care, which we look after more intensely, making sure they're the most comfortable they can be before they pass. I was able to spend a good amount of time of my shift being able to care for her in her final moments. As my shift ended, I got to say a last goodbye before I clocked off and went home to sleep. That night I had a dream where I was with my friends at the beach, and we were running down the stairs to head to the water, where I turned my head to the left and find the resident who I'd looked after sitting there staring at the ocean with just a blank look on her face. I walk up in front of her and greet her, asking if she was feeling okay. I remembered in my dream that she was meant to be in strict palliative care, to which she replied, No, I don't think I am." I kinda nodded to her and hoped that she'd feel better real soon, while I kind of wanted to wake up at that point. But the freaky part was when I woke up into another dream where I was lying on my stomach in my room, in my bed, where I was experiencing a sleep paralysis, and I hear behind me, you guessed it, the little old lady's voice telling me, "Victoria is dead, right? You know she was hurt, right?" Shortly after hearing that, I feel 2 hands push on my body as if they were trying to push me out of bed, at which point I woke up in the early morning around 4 a.m, heavy breathing and just straight up quite shaken. After going back to sleep and waking up in the morning and heading to work, I found out that the little old lady had passed away at the same time I woke up from my sleep paralysis. I've told this story to a few friends to freak them out, but I've never actually looked up details on this sort of thing happening. Call it paranormal or coincidence. I'm still not quite sure. I was a nurse for 7 years. In my entire career, I worked at a single facility. The facility had many renovations done during the years as it opened in 1960. By 2011, when I started working there, only half the facility was the original building, and the rest had all been added over the years. I worked nights, mostly because I'm a night owl and found it easier than morning work. I had a number of odd experiences, but I'll share the main ones that stick with me. Firstly, I had experiences with the supernatural since the age of 3, so I believe in the supernatural, but wasn't obsessed, more aware, if that makes sense. There was one wing in particular that was part of the original building, which had a small sitting room and a television for residents to enjoy during the day. During my night shifts, this one area gave me such a feeling of dread and fear that I would only be near it for as long as I had to. I would go out of my way and take the long way back to the nurse's station just to avoid being near it. Nothing I knew ever happened there, but my gut feeling was screaming at me that there was something there and it was not happy. This feeling eased during daylight, but once it was night, the feeling was there. It felt as if someone was watching me, and they didn't like the fact that I was there. I spoke to a few other nurses about this, and they all claimed they experienced the same feeling. One other experience sticks out to me. A 90-year-old woman called Jane went to breakfast, then asked to be taken back to her room for a sleep. She was a very healthy woman, but she said she wasn't feeling well. When the nurse did her next round 20 minutes later, they found that the resident had passed away in her sleep. I found out it was an aortic aneurysm, so she didn't suffer. Unfortunately, death is rarely quick in aged care, so usually a slow process of days or weeks. Jane was a very sweet Polish lady. She had outlived her children and her husband had passed many years ago, so she never had visitors. I would check on her and bring her tea at exactly 9:30 p.m. and say goodnight. As you could probably guess, not everything goes to schedule in healthcare, and it was not always possible to stick to a strict routine. But if it got to 9:35, she would ring her call bell and ask for her tea, then apologize profusely for ringing her bell, and every time I answered with, "Whenever you need help, press the button, it's not trouble, I love to help." She would then say her usual, "Good night, sweet girl," and I'd leave and get on with my shift. The funeral home was late to pick her up, and I helped the undertaker in the afternoon when my shift started. All the rooms had a call bell next to the toilet, one next to the bed, and the resident wore a necklace or bracelet with a call bell attached to it. When a resident passes, their room call bells are disconnected the same day, and the personal bell is put in the nurse's station ready for the next person to move in. At 9:36, the call bell went to her room started ringing again. This wasn't possible. Her room had been disconnected, and her personal bell was sitting in a drawer next to me. Slightly freaked, I went down to her room and checked to make sure there wasn't a dementia patient who just wandered in there. Maybe maintenance hadn't turned the bell off, even though I personally spoke to them after they did so. It was just trying to rationalize it, I suppose. I went into the room and it was pitch black. No one was inside and the bell had definitely been turned off, and I was unable to turn it off from inside the room, so I had to cancel it from the main desk. I instantly had a feeling of peace. Weird, because in every other situation I would have been a mess. I think perhaps she was just saying goodbye. As I was closing the door to her room, I heard a shriek, and my best friend came running down the corridor crying in a state. Once I got her to calm down, she said she was in the other wing chatting to Jane as she walked past her in her nightie. Then she turned the corner to the front wing, but when she looked around the corner, she wasn't there. She's dead. What the hell did she just see? I work in a rural mental health center in my hometown. This happened about a year after I started working there. I was also going to college full-time and only going to work part-time. I worked at the front desk at the time, and there was one particular client who took a liking to me. This guy had done a lot of meth in his day and basically fried his brain. He had drug-induced schizophrenia and is also really into conspiracy theories. At some point, we spoke while he was checking in, and he found out my mum's last name through that conversation. We have a different last name due to my parents' divorce, but for the life of me, I can't ever remember giving that personal information to a client. But it could have just been that he knew who my family was, since this was a rather small town. And basically everyone knows everyone. Not to mention my family owns a pretty large business in our town, but he remembers me telling him, so really who knows. About a month or two after, he started calling, 2 or 3 times a day, for me. Keep in mind I'm not a clinician. I don't have any one client to talk to, so it's weird for a client to ask for me, but he would only call when I was in class or on PTO days. One day his clinician pulled me aside and told me he was concerned for my safety because of this client. The client had come in for an appointment and told his therapist that he had a premonition about me. Something bad was going to happen to me, and he was going to be the one who saved me. Apparently one night, while they were watching his regular unsolved crime shows, he ran across a story about Leah Rochelle Pebble, who just so happens to have gone missing in the same state I live in, and shares my last name, and her middle name is similar to my first. On top of that, my co-worker named AJ and Leah had a pimp named AJ. He had gotten it into his head that I was Leah and that I had been taken by my family and my co-workers and brainwashed into thinking who I now was, and as a result lost all the memories from my previous life. He was determined to save me and return me to my correct family. After that, I started noticing his car around pretty much wherever I went. He stalked my Facebook and messaged all the family members I had listed and my top friends. Luckily, I had told these people about this guy and not to engage with him. When he didn't get a reply, he wouldn't push it, except with my mum, who also worked in the facility. I worked just in IT. He would message her daily asking about me, asking why she took me, and if she felt bad. I had to be walked in and out of work for about 6 months after, and I couldn't go anywhere in public alone. I think he dropped it eventually. I'm still not allowed to be out front when he's coming in, and occasionally still see his car drive by my house every once in a while, which is even creepier because I've moved twice since then. My dad died in 2016. I was able to spend a lot of time with him before he went, and my brother and I set him up in an amazing care facility in Australia, where he was for a few months before he went. The place had a small cafe with a barista, and I would frequently go and grab us a coffee. Dad couldn't walk anymore, and I was having a hard time getting him to a wheelchair to take him out of the room and outside. He also wasn't eating much or interested in much of anything. This was all pretty normal for someone who's dying. I knew he was, and I knew he'd go pretty soon, but nobody else seemed to think so for some reason. Anywho, I asked Dad if he'd like a latte, and for the first time in a few days he said yes. I was excited he was interested. So I headed over to the cafe, got us both a coffee and headed right back. I walked into the room and said, "I've got your coffee, Dad." I noticed Dad was staring into the far corner of the room. He looked from the corner of the room to me, and when I walked in, then after I spoke, he looked back to the corner and back at me and said, "What about Mum?" My mum died in 2008. Now, since I've seen ghosts and a bunch of weird experiences, I'm all aboard on this train, and without missing a beat, I look at the corner at him and say, "I can go get a coffee for Mum as well, no worries." And Dad looked from me to the corner, back at me, the reality clearly dawning on him. Then he quickly shook his head. While my dad did have some confusion when he first came to this place, he settled down pretty quick. He didn't see anything else after he mentioned that, and was lucid right up until the end. I'd like to think that my mum did come to see him off. I'd like to preface this by saying that not all mental health professionals are terrible people. Good doctors and good medication saved my life. I didn't grow up in the US. So if you see something in this story that makes you go, "That's not how this works," keep in mind that in other countries, there might be different laws. I was a troubled kid. I'm kind of a troubled person in general, but when I was in my early teens, specifically in this story 14, I was cutting, suicidal, and refusing to go to school. So I was put on a waiting list for a children's mental hospital. I know now for a fact that I was on the waiting list for close to half a year, and that should have been the first warning sign. At that time, I enjoyed being on sick leave from school, which basically meant I got to play The Sims until 6 in the morning for 5 months straight. But when I had to pack my stuff and actually go to the hospital, I, of course, didn't really want to go. I didn't want to get help, don't get me wrong, but the idea of being away from home for 6 weeks, which is the standard time they take to analyze you and watch you and give you a diagnosis, after which you can choose to pursue treatment, scares me. I arrived at the hospital in tears, my mum carrying my suitcase for me. The nurses noticed that obviously I didn't want to stay. "Are you here of your own free will?" the doctor asked me. I shook my head. They just shrugged it off, saying that they could get a judicial decision forcing me to stay here. I never got to talk to a judge. I never got to defend or explain myself, and as far as I knew, my parents didn't talk to a judge either. A judge glossed over my medical history and then signed a piece of paper that forced me to stay in the hellhole for the whole 6 weeks. The contents of my suitcase were searched, and I remember feeling like I had just arrived in prison. The first terrifying thing happened on my first night. As a cutter, my arms were in horrific shape. When my wounds healed, they'd itch. I scratched open some of my old scabs, and when I went to the nurse to ask for a bandage, everyone went nuts. In their eyes, I had purposely self-harmed, which they couldn't prove, but okay. So what do you do when a 14-year-old mental patient harms herself? Talk to her? Try to help? Nah. You take away all her jewelry, a necklace from my mom, a bracelet from my ex-girlfriend who, at the time, I still had very strong feelings for, and send her off out of her room for 24 hours. The timeout room was a small room with a big window that could just barely fit a bed. If I had to use the bathroom, I had to ask a nurse to accompany me. And no joke, at one point I was in the bathroom with a nurse standing guard in front of the door. She asked if I was doing okay, and I sarcastically responded with, "No, I'm cutting myself with toilet paper." She goes, "Really?" and rips open the door. All of my clothes, including my underwear and my PJs, were taken from my room and kept in the front office for the time I stayed in the timeout room. So whenever I needed clothes, I had to go up to the front office and ask for them. But apart from having to ask for clothes and bathroom trips, I was left completely alone in that room, and no one ever came to check on me. Getting out of the timeout room wasn't a lot better. For the first 2 weeks, I had horrible stomach problems. I would get up multiple times a night to use the bathroom, which, by the way, you didn't have one in your rooms, you had to walk down the hall to the bathrooms, because my stomach kept me up all night. I would often not get enough sleep and would end up sleeping through the day, which led me to not taking part in the group activities. And instead of, I don't know, waking me up, I was scolded, and I quote, "If I was up all night roaming the halls, I'd be tired too. What do you want me to do, just crap in the bed?" And because I didn't partake in group activities, I couldn't earn outside time. Yes, I had to earn going outside. Even just sitting on the front steps with a nurse right next to me had to be earned. For the first 6 weeks, I was effectively locked up, except for school and weekends where I was allowed to go home. It was blatantly obvious that none of the nurses really cared about any of the patients. They weren't even real nurses, they were more like prison guards. One of them straight up looked like a homeless guy. Another sounded like she'd been a 5-pack-a-day smoker her whole life. and I mean all of them were chain smokers. Every free second they'd use for smoke breaks, right outside the door too, with the doors open, so that all the other kids who were currently going through nicotine withdrawals could smell the cigarette smoke. I saw a real nurse once a week. She mainly checked for self-harm. One time, I self-harmed at home over the weekend. I told her my pet bunny did it, and she believed me. Within 6 weeks of staying at the mental hospital, I saw a psychiatrist a whopping 2 times. Once for a general introduction, and once for an IQ test. Oh, and did I mention that you were allowed to have a razor in the shower? Or the huge bird spider that sat in the corner of one of the showers for the entire time I stayed there? Or the cobwebs and silver fish that were everywhere? Anyone who's ever struggled with mental illness probably knows that sentences like, "just pull yourself together," or "get over it," are the least helpful things one could say to a mentally ill person. I've never heard it that much in my entire life. There was one instance where another patient, who was deadly afraid of spiders, came running out of her room in a borderline panic attack because she had woken up to a spider directly in front of her face. Know what they told her? "Don't be such a baby, it's just a spider." They gave her a broom for her to get rid of the spider herself, which obviously she couldn't do. My roommate and I ended up helping her. Both of us were scared of spiders as well, mind you. But possibly the most outrageous thing that happened on my second to last day. Someone had told the guards that I had smuggled in a razor blade, so they pulled me out of breakfast and searched my body from top to bottom, stripping me naked, with the door to the nurse's room wide open. When they didn't find a razor blade on me, they tore my room apart. They didn't find one in there either, but found one laying in the floor of the hallway. It was still in a wrapper. I wasn't the only patient who cut herself. As a matter of fact, I don't think there was a single female patient who didn't. That blade could have belonged to anyone. They had no proof that it was mine. But of course, it was determined that it was mine, and despite me not having any new cuts on my arms, I was thrown into the timeout for another 24 hours. Literally my last 24 hours. And they paid so little attention to the timeout room that a fellow inmate was able to slip a letter with a razor blade inside under the door so I could take out my frustration on myself. In case any of you were wondering where my parents were in all of this, my mother wanted to get me out of that place as soon as she heard about the timeout room. But since my parents had joint custody, she needed my father to agree to it. My father deserves a let's not meet story on himself, but to make it short, he hadn't spoken to me in over 4 years, but was somehow convinced that I needed help and refused to get me out of there. My final diagnosis from that place? Narcissistic neurosis. I was 14, and to this day I have no idea how they came up with any kind of diagnosis, considering I had seen an actual doctor a total of 2 times. Additionally, this result was delivered to us, my parents and I, by the head doctor of the hospital who I'd never seen in my life during a conclusive meeting on my last day. I was offered to stay and start behavioral therapy, but I guess it goes without saying that I politely declined that offer. Every therapist and psychiatrist I have spoken to since, and trust me, there have been a few over the last 7 years, have disregarded that diagnosis completely. Some have even laughed at it. I'm currently diagnosed with bipolar disorder and depression, and a panic disorder, and my current psychiatrist has suggested I might suffer from borderline personality disorder. I guess the moral of the story is to always do research on the hospital you plan on getting yourself admitted to. I sure as hell hope I never have to see any of the guards, nurses, or doctors ever again. I worked as a food delivery person in a hospital when I was younger. I mainly worked on the floor that was like a nursing home for older patients. I took a tray into a room once and asked the woman if I should leave it on her tray or if she was going to get up and go to her table. She told me not to bother because she wouldn't be needing food anymore. I was required to leave it, so I just said okay and left it on the table. I went back about an hour later to pick up trays and her room was empty. She'd passed away. I'll never forget that. I used to work med-surg. Sometimes when the ICU had room, they'll put some overflow patients down there, and we'll float down to take care of them. About 3 or 4 months ago, I floated down there. It was great because I only had to manage 3 patients, and I'm used to having 6 or 7. I hear some commotion and yelling down the hall, so I ran down there to see if the nurses needed help. I get to the room and see the nurse tech backed against the wall crying, and 3 ICU nurses trying to hold this man down, while a 4th gives him Altivan. Apparently he was withdrawing really bad from both alcohol and narcotics. I listened to him and realized what he was freaking out about. He was trying to sit up and scoot back, and he's screaming, "My legs, let go of my legs, you're burning me. Guys, it's trying to pull me off the bed and it's burning me." His legs were in soft restraints, and the nurse by his feet was trying to check to see what was wrong with them. But she wasn't pulling on them at all. But even when she wasn't touching his feet, he was screaming. Because someone wouldn't let go and they were burning him apparently. Almost like a demon was trying to pull him to hell. He died within about an hour and a half of that. I don't know why, but it scared me so badly that I thought I was going to puke for the rest of the night. My dad is a doctor. When he was a resident, he attended a woman who was in an ATV, the 4-wheeler type. It was a big accident. After a few surgeries, they managed to stabilize her. My dad didn't perform surgeries, he just assisted. A few days later, when he was doing routine checkups on her, she was awake and he came in the room. My dad asked her a few questions, and after a few of them she interrupted him, sat down on the bed and said, "You're a really good doctor. You've done what you can, but it's of no help. I'm going to die very soon." My dad claims she looked very pale and said those words very calmly, and died a few hours after that. I have cared for many elderly residents passing away, but my favorite story was a sweet lady called Vi. She was very weak and just beginning the process of actively dying. We were trying to pull her nightgown up to make sure she was dry, but she started fighting us tooth and nail to keep her gown down, while she stared into space. She'd never given us any lick of trouble in the department, and she had no modesty issues with the staff. We waited a couple of minutes and tried again, but she kept looking at the ceiling and batting us away with her hand. She was stone deaf, so there was no point explaining ourselves. Finally, on our 3rd attempt, Vi motioned with her hand and shouted, "Not in front of the angels." We backed off for a while after that, and she passed away that same night. Years ago, my father worked security at a hospital. The only place he didn't like patrolling was the morgue. There really wasn't a whole lot going on in the morgue, but sometimes the dead people on the table or vault would get up, moan, fart, burp, and other things that dead bodies do. Even though my father knew there was no need to worry, it still startled him. Sometimes a hospital nearby would use the morgue if they had overruns, and also the local police department would use it. So one day my dad's at work. He's talking to a receptionist called Debbie, who is a large, middle-aged older woman, and seems to be in okay health. They're just chit-chatting, usual small talk, and she lets him know she's really not feeling good today, and that she hasn't felt good for the past few days. My father mentions to her that maybe she just needs to go home and rest. She's been working hard, and perhaps needs to take it easy for a while. As they're talking, she says, "No, this is a different kind of feeling," and that she genuinely feels really bad. So my father goes back at the end of his shift to check up on her and says he'll catch her on Monday because it's Friday and the weekend's coming up. Right as he was leaving the hospital though, he was overcome with a very uneasy feeling. So Monday comes in and she doesn't show up for work. Tuesday and Wednesday roll around and she still doesn't come in. So my father asked her co-workers about her, and they hadn't heard from her, so my father guesses she must be taking some time off. The week progresses and Friday comes around. While making his rounds, he has to inspect the morgue. As he goes in, he does a quick sweep, but his eyes are drawn to a fresh body laying on the slab in the middle. He casually shines his flashlight in the direction when his stomach drops. He sees the body of his co-worker lying there on the slab, dead. My first job was at a skilled nursing facility. I usually worked day shift, but I had picked up night shift because they were so short-staffed. We only had a handful of people working at night, so it was pretty quiet. I'm sitting at the far end of the nurse's station, which is at the end of the back hallway. I hear a call light go off, and I remember thinking it was strange because the resident who lived in the room had end-stage dementia and didn't move much. I go to the room, and the blinds were moving, and the patient looked like she was sleeping. I called her name, and she didn't respond, which was her baseline. But then I put my hand on her shoulder, and she was dead cold. I turned the call light off and turned the light on. She had passed, and from the coolness of her skin and stiffness, I think it had been a while. I then went to find a CNA to help with her. I also figured the blinds were moving because of our old heater that sat under the blinds. I go back to my desk and check the chart for funeral information and such, and the call light goes off again. At this point I thought maybe a CNA was calling me to the room, so I walked back up down to the hallway to look for them. I then cancelled the call light from the nurse's station. There was no one around except for sleeping residents. I went to the nurse's station where one of our CNAs was sitting reading a book. I told her what happened, and she said she had been there the whole time. We head back down the hallway to find the light going off again and the door shut. Maybe I had shut the door, and maybe the heater was moving the curtains, but I'll never quite understand the call light. I truly believe she was letting us know that her soul was free from her body, and that she wanted to say goodbye to us. She was a long-term resident who never had visitors, and I truly think we were all she had in the end. Nothing ever spooky happened in the room again, or at least not for the following year that I was there. I'm usually a pretty jumpy person when it comes to supernatural stories and such, but for some strange reason I wasn't scared at all. It was like a peaceful goodbye. I don't know how else to explain it. When I was in high school, I got the flu very badly. I had such a high fever the doctors were worried about seizures and/or brain damage. In the hospital, and after they were able to get me to a semi-human temperature, they wanted to x-ray my lungs for damage. I went to walk to radiology, but my doctor saw me, panicked, and said I should not be standing, let alone walking. So they plop me in a wheelchair and roll me down. My nurse situates me near the machine and tells me to wait there for her, and then we'd get started. She left the room, and I just was kind of looking around, waiting, and I saw another nurse, very pretty with dark hair, in the room. She told me to go with her. I shook my head and said no, and the other nurse said I needed to stay here. The pretty nurse asked if I was sure, and I said yes. My nurse came back and began to get me ready for my chest x-ray. It was then that I noticed that the door she entered from was the only one, and the pretty nurse was gone. So in the end, I think I was dying, and an angel told me to go with her, but I said no. I had a patient with cirrhosis related to fatty liver. I cancelled him heavily prior to this for him to lose weight, but he didn't heed my advice. He developed diabetes and then developed a terrible, non-healing ulcer on his leg, then the other. Both soon spread to gangrene and he was admitted to hospital for bilateral leg amputations. He only said one thing to me after he woke up after the operation. "Doctor, good news, I've lost a bit of weight." He died a few hours later. I miss him very much. The last place I worked, like so many other wards here in Denmark, had a 6-hour room, where dead patients stay for 6 hours before they're checked again for signs of death and moved to the morgue, still attached to the hospital. It's rather large. Not sure if that's a thing in other countries. The patients are required to have a call line within reach in case they wake up and are in fact not dead. So there are 5 or 6 call lines in the room. Anyway, it was an ER, and we had a fair amount of dead patients wait in that room over the years. Every now and then, and usually during a night shift, the call light would go on from that room, even without any patients in there. You just have to go down there, turn them off again, and sometimes they would go on again just as you left the room. Creepy as hell. I never liked going down there. I always felt alone. I don't know, it was thick or tense. The technicians came and checked the connections and stuff, but everything worked without any problems. I was taking care of an elderly patient. A very, very elderly patient. Actually, the oldest person I've ever taken care of. I don't remember why she was admitted, but it was minor, and she was due to go home the next day. She was A&O times 3, a very sharp lady, and she and I were having a nice little chat, and I was getting ready to wrap things up when she said, "I just want to know, who's that little girl who's standing behind you?" The hairs on the back of my neck raised up. I ran through a quick assessment again. She knew who she was, where she was, what year it was, why she was in the hospital, yet seeing invisible children in her room. What? I assured her there was no one else in the room. She's very nonplussed about it. I go outside the nurse's station and have the "my patient is hallucinating ghost children, please help" conversation with my nurse in charge, and she goes, "Oh, your patient is in room 26? Yeah, I figured. She's the 3rd or 4th person we've had there who's seen little children in that room." I work as a teletech while I'm in school, and when the unit secretary leaves for lunch, I will cover the desk for the time being, since it's right outside the tele room. I was sorting the heart rhythm strips, and someone walked up to the desk and said he was looking for the exit. I pointed him in the direction right as I looked up to acknowledge him standing there and saw he was in a gown with the wristband. So I asked him his room number and to wait while I called his PCA to walk with him downstairs. I called the PCA and gave her the room number. She told me, "That can't be the right room. That patient died about 20 minutes ago. Was it his family?" I told her he had a wristband on, but maybe I had heard or was given the wrong room number. She came to the desk to cover the monitors for me, and I went to go peek into the room he told me and see if it was the wrong room and to find which room he was in. Sure enough, laying dead in the bed was the same guy who walked up to the desk no longer than 10 minutes before I went in there. I am a nurse who used to work the graveyard shift in a psych unit in a large hospital outside Chicago. Normally there would be 2 nurses in our shift, but on this particular night we had Joyce, who was still on orientation phase. When it was Joyce's turn at around 2 a.m. to have a 1-hour break, the charge nurse, Pam, told her she may use the MSW's office at the end of the hallway, so the night supervisor couldn't see her sleeping. This office has a couch which anyone can comfortably sleep. About half-hour passed, and I saw Joyce in the hallway looking so terrified. Pam quickly glanced up at her from the computer. "You're up too early. Go back." Joyce, who's pale and out of breath, "I just had a dream. It was almost real. I dreamt that I was in the same dark office lying on the couch, and there was a black cat looking at me. For a long time. Then, slowly, I felt like 2 hands were choking me in the dark. I couldn't breathe. Then the cat jumped across my body. Then at that moment, I woke up and it felt so real." Pam, who now had her full attention on Joyce, "Look at your neck. You have red scratches." There really were red scratches on Joyce's neck, like somebody or something held her neck for a long time. We didn't use that office for breaks anymore. I was in there myself when this happened and couldn't stand the darkness of the room. I felt like someone was watching me always and was never able to sleep at all. I used to work in a hospital built at the turn of the century. Nurses never went on rounds by themselves because something would happen. Banging doors, flickering lights, ghostly whispers, objects moved, you name it, it happened. Generally a rule of death stalks these corridors at night. Lots of reports of dark shadows and patients passing away. Scariest story while I was there? Isolation room at the end of the ward. The patient was visibly impaired and had basically no sight at all anymore. We're doing our rounds after midnight, around 3 a.m, and we hear him talking and having a grand old conversation and laughing. We walk in to find an empty room and our typically never ever confused patient insisting that his friend who died 3 years ago had been visiting him earlier. I was off the next 2 nights. Came back to find out that the patient had passed away at almost the exact time he had been talking to his friend the night before. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I'm feeling quite tired, I'm not entirely sure why. It's not even very late yet. Thank you everyone for your continued viewership, it really means a lot. I really like hospital stories, especially ghost hospital stories. Yes, they are quite creepy indeed. If anyone has any stories to share, they can send me an email, link in the description as always. And a huge thanks to my wonderful members and patrons for their continued support and contribution. It really does mean a lot and it helps keeps the channel ticking over. That's it from me though guys, take care, stay awesome and I'll see you in the next one.